All right, guys. So we're here doing Chapter 7, Module 23. Chapter 7 only has two modules. It's on the human population. And so we'll go ahead and get started. So in this section, before we talked about the numbers, what defines human population, in this module, we're going to talk about describing how populations change for a country. We're going to look at something called the demographic transition, how it follows economic development for uh, each country. We're going to explain how relationships among population size, economic development, and resource consumption influence the environment, and describe why sustainable development is a common but hard goal, elusive goal for countries to get to. So demographic transition follows economic development. Basically, the more your economy grows, your population changes. It would go through what we call the demographic transition, and this is all based on the theory of demographic transition, which is the theory that as a country moves from subsistence, people taking care of themselves, farming off the land, that kind of stuff, from when it goes from that to industrialized, people increase their affluence, and that basically is their wealth. And it undergoes a predictable shift in population growth. Every country that has gone through this has had pretty much the same population dynamic shift going on. And even our LEDCs are seeing going through demographic transitions right now, whereas nobody's really at the bottom of the demographic transition anymore. A developed country is what we've been referring to in ACE, and this is an AP book, but when you see the word developed, that's what we'd call an MEDC, or a more economically developed country. And that's a country with a relatively high level of industrialization and income. And a developing country is going to be your LEDCs, low levels of industrialization and income. Affluence is the state of having plentiful wealth, including the possession of money, goods, and or property. Um, Here it is. This is pretty much the theory of demographic transition in a graph. Pretty much you have four phases here, right? Phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4. What happens in those is very predictable. So in phase 1, you have high birth and high death rates. This is pre-industrial. And the reason you have high birth rates and high death rates, we're going to get into very quickly. Let me point out, in the y-axis, you've got birth and death rates per 1,000 people, and then you've got time. What's going to happen first, because of the introduction of modern medicine, pretty much, and sanitary conditions and things like that, all kinds of stuff, is your death rate will see a major drop. And that's when you know you're in phase 2. When the death rate starts to drop, you're in phase 2. That is followed by a decrease, and it's a little bit later, in birth rate. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. All right, so the birth rates don't change yet in phase 2, but they start to drop in phase 2. Now, what happens in phase 3 is that your deaths will pretty much level out. You may see a slight increase, but what happens to your birth rates is your birth rates will start to drop. People will start having less kids. It's not that the kids are dying. That's what's happening here, because you have a lot of infant mortality here. It's just people stop having as many kids as they had before. And finally, in phase 4, you basically have a leveling out of both the birth and the death rate. So let's see what happens to the actual population. So your population is very low comparatively in phase 1. The reason that your population, which is the purple line, the reason that the population is low is because a lot of people are dying. Even though you have a lot of people being born, you still have a lot of infant mortality, a lot of people dying. Well, when that death rate starts to drop in phase 2 and your birth rate's still really high, that's where you see the major increase. So you see this a lot in our LEDCs currently. You'll see major increases because a lot of them are in phase 2. That increase continues in phase 3, but will start to level off at the end of phase 3 because the birth rate and death rate are both getting lower, and will finally phase out in phase 4, level out. You have a higher population than what you began with. But you do have a leveling off. And this is called the theory of demographic transition. And this is just really what happens and why. So why did phase 2 happen? Why did the death rate drop? Well, the death rate dropped and birth rate pretty much stays high, but the death rate drops because of better sanitation, cleaner drinking water, and availability of food and health care. That's what happens once you start to getting more affluent. You start getting all of these things because your country can afford them now at this point. Phase 3 is where you have stable population growth. It starts to level off a little bit, but the economy and educational system improve, and people have fewer children. See, now in phase 2 and phase 1, people had a lot of children. It was a subsistence economy. People needed children. People need children in those types of situations in order to work the farm, to actually be laborers for the family, and so they'll have a lot of children. Also, they know that there's a high rate of infant mortality, so they'll have more children because of that as well. What happens though is in phase 2, people are still having a lot of babies, all right? They haven't gone through and seen that all these children are going to survive, and that they are going to get different types of jobs outside of providing just for their own family. They will get jobs in cities and things like that. People will still have lots of babies. It's just that they're dying at a slower rate. So what's going to happen here is that's where you have your major population increase. Then in phase 3, people do start having less children because they have now gone through a period of time where they realize that amount of children is not necessary in order to sustain their life. And then phase 4 is going to be maybe even some declining population because of the relatively high level of affluence and economic development, encouraging women to delay having children, and so people will end up having less and less and less kids. I can even see this throughout my own life. My parents, your grandparents, probably generation, they probably had a lot of siblings compared to you guys. Usually, nowadays, families are 1, 2, 3 kids. I have 3 kids. That's a lot. Comparatively for our generation, but that wouldn't have been a lot even like 30, 40 years ago. So, family planning is the practice of regulation of the number of spacing and offspring through the use of birth control. And this really comes along with education and better jobs, and people end up basically actually doing better job of family planning and having a lower fertility rate, which is really good for their country if you don't have explosion of population and the resources to provide for them. So as you can see, the difference between educated and uneducated women in these 6 countries produces vastly different fertility rates, where you have difference between 6.1 and 2.0 children per woman of childbearing age in Ethiopia, and it's basically repeated over all these countries. Now, both population and economic development contribute to the consumption of resources and to the human impact on the environment. So, we're pretty rough on the environment in America, but we don't have a population problem per se like Africa does. Now, Africa per capita and per person, they are way less harmful on the environment than Americans are. However, with their population explosion, it can kind of even out to what we've got going on here because of the, even though they're per person doing less harm to the environment, there's so many people in a lot of these countries that they'll have as strong or a stronger impact overall on the environment. You can see the resource use in developed and developing countries. We are the highest MEDC in terms of overall resource use, okay? I mean, not resource use, this is population. I'm sorry. So you can see the population. We are the 3rd most populous country in the world. And they still count China as a developing or LEDC here. Like I've been telling you guys during this year, it is more transitional now at this point. But look at the vast number of people in China and India as compared to the United States. And that's because they had the high birth rates going on with worldwide economic increases. And so you can definitely see major populations there, over billions of people in those countries. Now you can see here, this is where the resource use per capita, which means per person, in every single one of these that you see in this upper part here, these are all MEDCs. So per person, we use by far the most resources. In the United States is number one. And this is the ecological footprint, hectare per capita. So the amount of area it takes to support one person. United States is way higher than those two other countries. Now, the thing is that when you combine them, though, China and India are very high on their total resource use, even though per person it's less because they have so many people. So to estimate the impact of human lifestyles on the Earth, environmental scientists developed something called the IPAT equation, where the I stands for the impact of human lifestyle on the environment. So it's equal to the impact is equal to the population times the affluence times the technology. Now, it's not a real equation. It just means that the human impact increases with increasing population, with increasing affluence, and with increasing technology. All right. So usually we define a country's resources use and its affluence by their GDP. I'm sure you've heard that term before. It's the gross domestic product, and that's a measure of the value of all the products and services produced in a country in 1 year. Usually, the higher on the GDP, the more developed we say the country is. All right. So the scale of an impact depends on the nature of the economy and the degree to which society has developed. So how developed are they? What's the nature of how much wealth this country has? Highly localized impacts are typical of rural, agriculturally based societies. So if it's an impact that just basically is affecting the population of just that country or just that town or just that city, that would be more of your LEDCs. Global impacts are usually seen more on the affluent or MEDC societies. We are the ones like the United States that uses the more land, that will produce the more carbon dioxide, more pollutants in the air. So that's globally, usually it's the MEDCs being the issue there. Locally, though, those do add up to global problems if you add them all up together. So what is an urban area? An urban area is an area that contains more than 385 people per square kilometer or 1,000 people per square mile. Those are what we typically define as urban areas. Finding them more and more in LEDCs, honestly. It used to just be pretty much an MEDC problem. You can see here we're looking at urban growth in the world. Overall, we're going to go from the percentage of people living in urban areas from 50% to 60% by 2030. Developed countries, you see a very small increase in that. However, we're going from 75 to 80, where you see a bigger jump in the LEDCs or developing countries. You can see here the 20 largest urban areas in the world, with Tokyo, Japan, being by far number one, then Delhi, India, Mexico City. If you've ever been to New York City, that's number 4 on the list. So you know how crowded that is as number 4 on the list. So finally, we're going to talk about sustainable development. So sustainability, what we've talked about, and reducing the impact of an increasing population on the world. How can we do that and create a sustainable society, a society that can continue to function and as good as we can, as high of a level as we can, but still protect the environment to protect us and those around us. So ecosystem sustainability will be threatened, according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, if the human population continues along its current path of resource consumption around the globe. So the continued alterations to ecosystems that we've done to farm certain types of crops, to raise animals, to produce all the stuff that to make plastic, to use fossil fuels, to make transportation. Those alterations that we do to ecosystems have improved human well-being, but they also exacerbate poverty and produce pollution. So some of the stuff that we've done has been good, right? We have greater access to food, we have clean water, we have suitable housing. However, we need to get more sustainable with what we do in order to mitigate the harmful effects of the things that we've done to make our lives easier. So the bottom line is, if we establish sustainable practices, we may be able to improve the standard of living for a large number of people. So while we have population growth, we do expect expect it to level off.